Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.
Good Thursday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service. It's the 9th of January. As always, we encourage you to visit our website for the very latest weather information where you are. You can do that by heading to weather.gov, or if you like the entire statewide view, arh.noaa.gov will get you to the Alaska Weather Service. The weather info line's open at 800-472-0391. Find each Weather Service office on Twitter, on Facebook under U.S. National Weather Service Alaska, and on YouTube. And early in the afternoon, you'll get NWS Anchorage's version of a daily weather brief, just the surface maps that you'll see here in a minute. And then following this show on alaskapublic.org, you can find the entire broadcast of what you're watching right now, which is what I'm saying. And then if you watch that online, then you kind of get a mirror effect. It'll be fun. Try it out. Here's a look at the hazardous weather situation right now across Alaska. The only watches, warnings, or advisories that we have is up across the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast. That is for wind chill advisories. And with the wind and a frontal boundary coming in off the Arctic coast, we're expecting those wind chill values to drop as low as 50 to 55 below, and that could carry on through Friday. There's questions right now about what will happen as we get into the weekend, but for right now you need to prepare for extreme cold, or at least extreme feels like kind of cold. And then remember that use extreme caution if you're going to be outside for any length of time, even if it's just a quick dash. Make sure you've got everything covered up and tight, because just a matter of minutes there or less for frostbite to set in, or worse, of course. So again, winter weather advisory for the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast through Friday afternoon and evening, and then we'll see about Saturday and Sunday. More information to come as we head into tomorrow, of course. Here's a look at the satellite picture out across the west in the Bering Sea. Two things to point out here before we set this into motion. We've got low pressure here south of the Alaska Peninsula moving toward Kodiak Island. We've got another low here across the central Bering Sea and a lot of low clouds on the north side of that. And then here's the storm that's really going to shake things up as we get into the weekend. Watch what happens here. This storm coming off of the eastern Asia continent, also followed by another low just to the west and southwest. This is going to bring probably gale and storm force winds to the Pacific side of the Aleutians as we go ahead in the next couple days. Watch what happens as this storm is moving eastward. We're already kind of pushing these other storms out of the way. We've got this weak wave south and west of the Kuskokwim Bay and very near the Pribilofs. This is stirring up some snow now and also helping to drag in some of that colder northerly wind through the Bering Strait. Now taking us to the Alaska view, look at southeast, and you'll notice pockets of rain and plenty of cloud cover across the Panhandle earlier today. Also watch for circulation moving over the Kenai Peninsula and then kind of drifting and holding right around Prince William Sound. That's what's keeping a lot of the low clouds around south central. Out to the west again, there's our Bering Sea low, and notice the wealth of clouds across most of Alaska. Now, for those of you hoping to get a glimpse of the aurora tonight, chances are going to be, well, we won't say impossible, but there are plenty of clouds around most of the 49th. So it's going to be pretty lucky if you get to see the aurora, the northern lights, tonight where you are. There will be some better spots than others. If you are in the interior, of course, you'll have a better chance, mainly north of the Yukon Valley and into the Brooks Range, probably some pockets on the Arctic coast and maybe out around the Seward Peninsula. There seem to be some breaks around south central, but not a whole lot there, so it's going to be really hit and miss. If you're farther south and west toward Sand Point on Alaska, you probably have a decent shot, and there's some pockets of clearing across southeast. But this is a pretty strong geomagnetic storm. And so there's a decent chance that a lot of folks, perhaps not in Alaska, will have a decent opportunity to see the northern lights or the aurora. Now, back to the weather. Out across the west, you can see the clouds moving in fairly quickly to the central and western parts of the Aleutians. That's that bigger storm that we were watching on the wider view of the Bering Sea and the northern Pacific moments ago. As this traverses the North Pacific, it will stretch out across the Gulf, and as we head into the weekend, it's possible that this storm will be kind of the impetus to start some other effects across south central and southwestern Alaska going into the weekend, perhaps early next week. Could include winds, could include rain, freezing rain, and snow. And of course, it's probably going to affect southeast as well. Most of these storms at this point, along with this storm track, have been bringing a decent amount of rain and snow to the Panhandle. So some widespread effects, and this is just getting started, so there's no way we can actually say what will happen in pinpoint fashion just yet, but it's certainly something that we need to keep an eye on, again, as that storm starts to bottom out. Right now it's at 973 millibars and just barely on our weather map out to the west. Let's focus on what's going on in southeast first. At 988 millibars, this low is trying to curve its way back in across the coast. We're going to see more of an onshore flow for now for southeast. Most of the rain today seemed to have been concentrated across some of the southern parts of the Panhandle, though Juneau and Sitka did manage to get out anywhere from a ½ inch to 3/4 of an inch of rainfall today. Low pressure sitting on the western side of Prince William Sound brought in a little bit of light snow to south central last night and early this morning, and there's been lingering pockets of freezing drizzle around the area. Super cooled water droplets just haven't really made it into snow form. But it's not any sizable event, just enough to make things slick if you're driving in area roads through the valley, perhaps south central, the Kenai Peninsula. Scattered snow showers will remain relatively light today and through the rest of tonight, which means, again, a little more trouble watching the aurora. Notice up north, a cold front coming into the Arctic coast will drop southward and slowly scrape across the north slope. As it does that, the winds are going to pick up, and that's where that wind chill advisory comes into play for the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast, with those values going as low as 55 below. There's our North Pacific low. Once again, it's going to ride the Aleutians pretty much from west to east on the Pacific side, and that's going to keep the strongest winds on the Pacific side. You'll notice gales and storm force winds there for places like Adak out toward Kiska. Those will go in tomorrow. As you look at Friday, there's a storm. The center of the storm is coming into the extreme southern parts of the Bering at 965 millibars, probably some rain and snow with that. Right now, it doesn't look like any sizable snow accumulations with that. We'll have precipitation stretching across the north and eastern Gulf Coast, and low pressure is working its way up through the central Gulf at 975 millibars. Well, just in time for at least maybe a little daylight. You'll see a little bit of clearing across the interior, scattered snow showers across parts of the Norton Sound. And that front across the north is not moving very much at all, and that's going to keep the concentration of stronger winds across the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast, thus the wind chill advisory we were talking about once again. That may bring in some snow as well. The concentration of that probably around Prudhoe Bay and points east. Most of that looks pretty minimal. It will be the wind and the cold that's the main issue. Heading into Saturday, that front not moving very much. In fact, it's stretching out more to the north and east with the circulation there across the Arctic Ocean at 980 millibars. Notice the northerly flow here coming down toward Point Hope as well and into the Kotzebue Sound region. Likely some blowing and drifting snow with that, as well as accumulating snow around the Chukchi Seacoast. We'll have some pockets of snow across the central Bering Sea. Low pressure now very near the Pribilofs at 970 millibars. Will stretch out an occluded front across the Alaska Peninsula. And here's our triple point. This will likely develop another area of low pressure as we head through the weekend, and that's what we're watching to see how that affects south central, and eventually this will break off and move towards southeast. So you'll be under a ridge of high pressure at least for the beginning part of the weekend, probably a scattering of light precipitation as that happens, and then once this moves a little bit closer to the coast, things will begin to change fairly quickly, maybe as early as Saturday night into Sunday for the Panhandle there. So a lot taking shape and still forming as we head toward the weekend, even though that's a day or so away. The storm, as it develops, will have some pretty big impacts on a large part of the southern third of Alaska. Here's a look at temperatures now across southeast. Afternoon readings at 4 o'clock. We're mainly in the upper 30s across the Panhandle. Juneau is around 39, about the same for Haines and Skagway. Ketchikan and Annette, pretty close to 40 degrees. Prince William Sound temperatures in the upper 20s and lower 30s. Homer and Seward both in the mid 30s this afternoon. 19 in Talkeetna. Anchorage was around 29 degrees. Glen Allen showing 17. Fairbanks and up around the Alaska range, most areas were hugging the single-digit temperatures pretty closely today with very little change there. Farther north still, you'll notice most areas from Fort Yukon into Arctic Village and the Arctic coast, anywhere from 10, 15 to as cold as 33 below there in Arctic Village. Kaktovik was 13 below, Barrow 10 below. Most areas around Kotzebue Sound, we're looking at single-digit temps to about 10 degrees there in Shishmaref. 20 in Nome, about the same there in Unalakleet. 7's not too far behind. McGrath had snow this afternoon at 12. Grayling was around 14. Bethel and Nunivak Island in the 20s and 30s this afternoon. Southwest Alaska is looking at temps in the upper 20s to low 30s. Dillingham and King Salmon, as well as Cape Newingham, made it at or above freezing this afternoon for a brief time. St. Paul and St. George also in the mid-30s again with snow today. 33 in Kodiak, Sandpoint about 39 and 1 degree warmer just down the road at Sandpoint and Cold Bay. And 37 in Unalaska Dutch Harbor. Most areas in the central and western Aleutians we're seeing temperatures in the low to mid 30s there. That's all ahead of the storm, of course, and overnight temperatures there won't change very much. Look for areas in the YK Delta to hold in the teens and 20s for most areas. Probably a little cooling there taking shape right now for Bristol Bay. 31 in Kodiak. Temps in the teens and 20s for South Central and the Mat-Su Valley, probably colder in the mid-teens there. Watch for some fog to develop there if you see any clearing at all, which also isn't good for aurora viewing, unfortunately. Low to mid-30s for Southeast around Ketchikan and Annette. You'll see high lows in the upper 30s with Juneau working toward 34 degrees overnight, about the same in Haines and Skagway. Into the interior, overnight lows will fall off to about 10 below in Fairbanks, as cold as 36 below around Arctic Village and 15 to 30 below across the Arctic coast, with Nome coming in at 6. A high temperature tomorrow there of 9 degrees for the interior, 5 to 15 below. North of the Yukon, that gets colder into the Brooks Range at 20 to 35 below. And across the Arctic coast, 10 to about 25 below there. Places like Prudhoe Bay about 25. South Central, 20s and 30s. Kodiak, 37. The Alaska Peninsula in the upper 30s, closing in on 40 around Sandpoint. And Dutch Harbor on Alaska, about 40 or so in Shemya. Southeast looking at high temperatures in the mid to upper 30s. A little bit warmer in Sitka, though, at 41. About the same there for Ketchikan. Here's a look at your flying weather now. As you would expect, ahead of that Bering Sea storm, we've got plenty of IFR conditions stretching from the eastern part of Russia all the way through Nunivak Island and into Bristol Bay. The second storm, the one that's moving out of the Pacific now, will also have a band of IFR developing throughout the day, as far west as Shemya and as far east as Dutch Harbor. That's a pretty narrow band there as a crow flies. You'll notice a wide area of IFR as well from the Copper River Basin and coastline into northern parts of southeast, and MVFR continues for the bulk of southeastern Alaska as well as northern parts thanks to blowing and drifting snow. Pass conditions now, Anaktuvuk Pass, VFR conditions. We expect the same there for Adigan Pass throughout the day. You'll notice that Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, expect to see some improvements throughout the day. The worst will likely be in the morning hours at IFR. Rainy Pass, expected to see marginal flight conditions, and we should see even better conditions there around Windy Pass, perhaps VFR by the afternoon. Isabel Pass trending toward VFR as the day goes on, and it looks like Mentasta Pass, marginal flight conditions are expected there. Tanita Pass, probably marginal conditions throughout your Friday. And put a nice end on the note for Portage Pass, MVFR trending toward VFR conditions as we go through your Friday. Chilkoot and White Pass likely get worse throughout the day. Marginal at least, maybe leaning over toward IFR conditions there. Freezing levels now, as you would expect with the cold weather, the surface freezing line pretty much hugging the Gulf Coast all the way around the Horn through Bristol Bay, but it is still north of the Pribilofs and south of St. Matthew and mainly north and west of Attu. The elevated freezing lines are pretty spread out across the central and eastern Gulf without a major surge of a storm pulling in that warm air aloft. But we'll start to see some changes here in the next couple days just south of the Aleutian chain, and eventually that should work its way into the Gulf with that storm moving in from the North Pacific and the west. Icing potential is fairly limited right now. We've seen a few reports from pilots like you today, below 5,000 feet across South Central in the Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula region into northern parts of Southeast. Most of the southern parts of Southeast don't really look like we'll see too many issues there. And for areas south of the Pribilofs all the way out to the western parts of the chain, below 5,000 feet, but above 2,000 feet, thanks to the freezing conditions there and a little bit of moisture. So mainly light to isolated moderate across these areas here, with the bulk of the freezing probably happening a little bit farther south. Jet stream conditions now, a pretty active pattern, and one that's really going to strengthen in time as we go into the weekend. Notice out west we have just a beeline of jet stream traffic coming right in across the North Pacific. This is moving in right off of Asia, and it looks like in the forecast models that this area here is probably going to get faster over the weekend. So here's your superhighway, and here are your secondary roads if you want to look at it like that. This is where the storm path is coming in out of eastern Asia and just zipping in and bringing in that larger storm that we're watching on our surface chart. Well, it will likely be reinforced as it gets into this area here with the strengthening jet. Meanwhile, up north, high pressure is bringing in that cold. If you want to say the polar vortex, if you're watching the news, everybody's talking about the polar vortex. We are always talking about the polar vortex, just not so much a name. This cold is kind of going to wrap back in here and reinforce that northerly flow into the interior and especially along the Arctic coast. Well, once the storm kind of makes it into this area here over the course of the weekend, this will likely move its way into the Pacific Northwest and maybe swing some more cold to the lower 48. As far as we're concerned, low pressure is the dominant factor there across the eastern Gulf right now. You can see it's zipping in that south and southeasterly flow into parts of southeastern Alaska. We've got weak northerly winds right now across the interior, running around 10 to 20 knots or so, and a decent northerly flow actually hitting the coast as well, between 30 and 40 knots. Here's our next wave. Low pressure here sitting just north of the Aleutians. Should bring in the strongest winds on the south side of the chain. Those winds could reach upwards of 50 to 80 knots, again the strongest of which will be on the south side of the chain. As we look at 3,000 feet by Friday afternoon, northerly winds are still pretty light at this level. In fact, only 5 knots or so coming over the eastern Alaska range and into south central Alaska. We've got some difference in the wind pattern here across the Gulf of Alaska. A little bit of convergence could bring in some turbulence at times. Light winds across southeast. Most of that's moving in from southeast and out to the west. Our low pressure pattern here coming into the northern parts, or the southern parts of the Bering Sea, I should say, still shows the strongest winds, mainly on the south side. A lot of those winds between 35 and about 65 knots or so could bring those storm force winds up again from Atka out toward Kiska and maybe points west as well. So make sure you're checking the latest forecast for the marine interests there, especially in the central and western Aleutians tonight and tomorrow. Turbulence then, not a whole lot going on in southeast. You might find some bumps here across the central and eastern Alaska range. Below 4,000 feet as the front's moving into the Arctic coast. And then for the central and western parts of the chain, mainly below 5,000 feet. Some of that could reach occasional to widespread moderate. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back in just a few minutes with a look at your marine weather. Stay tuned.
The wimpy moon points the way to the biggest planet and UFO alert.
Hey there, stargazers. I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida. Let's show you how to use the moon next week to help you identify the giant planet Jupiter.
I'm Marlene Hidalgo, science teacher from Miami, Florida. Be on the lookout next Wednesday for the wimpiest full moon of 2014.
And I'm Dean Regas, astronomer from the Cincinnati Observatory. UFO season opens once again next week because whenever a certain thing happens in the heavens, UFO reports come in from all over. Let's show you.
Let's look east at 9 p.m. Monday the 13th. You'll see a big bright moon if the clouds cooperate. You won't even need a dark sky. This works great even from the bright lights of a city.
Down to the left of the moon is a bright spot of light, Jupiter, which is extra bright right now because our Earth has just passed between Jupiter and the Sun. But when this happens, Jupiter is extra bright because it's so close.
I know you've heard us say that Jupiter is the biggest planet, but Jupiter is actually bigger than all of the rest of the planets put together. You can throw in all the planets, Earth included, then toss in Pluto, all the asteroids, all the comets, all the minor planets, and Jupiter is still about 50% more massive than all that pile of planetary stuff.
The next night, the 14th, the moon is much closer to Jupiter, only 5 degrees to Jupiter's right. The next night, the 15th, the moon is well below Jupiter, and I want you to take a close look at this nearly full moon. At midnight Eastern time, the moon will be full, and this is the wimpiest, the smallest full moon of the year.
It really doesn't look any different from any other full moon with your naked eye. But this full moon is the most distant for 2014, about 30,000 miles farther away than the full moon in August of 2014.
It really is smaller by about 13%, but you really can't tell it with just your naked eye. The next night, the 16th, the moon is even lower at 9 p.m. and will rise well after Jupiter, so you'll have a good chance to observe Jupiter in a dark sky before the moon rises.
But what about that UFO alert we were talking about?
Okay, we're looking east-southeast about an hour before sunrise, and if you have a clear flat horizon, unobstructed by trees or buildings, you may see a very bright UFO-like light hovering along the horizon.
Keep looking each morning next week, and just before dawn, our bright UFO light will hover just a little bit higher above the horizon. And sometime over the next week or so, the UFO reports will come in. And it's easy to understand why. Because our UFO is really the planet Venus, the brightest planet in the heavens.
And because Venus has just reappeared as a morning star after having been the evening star since last spring, it surprises people. And several factors, one of which is called autokinesis, sometimes makes Venus appear to move back and forth or up and down in a most unplanet-like but UFO-like fashion. And so people are easily fooled.
In fact, if you stare at Venus long enough, you just may be able to see this effect for yourself. It may seem to wander up and down or sideways. And although some people think it's funny that other people mistake Venus for a UFO, don't be too hard on anybody because it's a perfectly natural result of the way our eyes work.
In fact, in the spring of 2012, a pilot for an airline, which will remain nameless, made a panic dive to avoid what he thought was another plane nearly dead ahead.
And it gets even better, because one naval admiral was very embarrassed by the fact that he actually ordered his ship to fire on the intruder. But intruder it is not. Indeed, it is 25 million miles away from us this week, and if Venus were sentient and had a sense of humor, it would probably smile at us Earthlings who are so frequently fooled and frightened by its comings and goings.
So get outside some morning just before dawn next week to see an IFO, an identified flying object, just before sunrise in the east-southeast, and prove to yourself that it's really fun to
Keep looking up.
The latest sea ice conditions show that shore-fast ice is working its way down the coast from Nunivak Island into parts of Bristol Bay and, of course, into Cook Inlet as well. Hasn't quite reached the Pribilofs, as we were talking about yesterday, but you'd like to examine the sea surface temperatures or check on the latest ice conditions or the outlook for the next several weeks to come. You can always do that from our Sea Ice Program's webpage, weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. Here's a look at the marine forecast now for southeast. Onshore flow between 20 and 25 knots coming into places like Gustavus and Sitka, with seas running around 14 to 16 feet as you head down toward the Dixon entrance. Southwesterly still running a little strong between the central and southern parts of the inner channels, around 20 knots with 4-foot seas there, 5-foot seas into the Lynn Canal with a southerly flow, 25 knots. That reverses course on Saturday. Northerlies at 15 knots, a southwesterly flow through Stevens Passage and the central inner channels, and farther south, a northwesterly flow there develops at 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. We keep the onshore flow south of Gustavus all the way down to Craig between 20 and 30 knots, and in Yakutat, a southerly flow develops. That's a little bit lighter at 15 knots with an 8-foot sea. Around South Central, variable winds inside Prince William Sound in the northern parts of Cook Inlet, and in sea ice-free waters, the seas will run around 2 feet. You'll find similar conditions west and south of Kenai. Into the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay area, that's a westerly flow around 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. Shelikof Straits looking at westerlies, as well as the eastern side of Kodiak Island and most of the western parts of the Gulf. 20-knot winds there with 8 to 9-foot seas, but as we go into Saturday, things start to change a little bit as that low pressure wave moves across the North Pacific. We start to get more of a stronger north and easterly flow coming down the inlet and through the Barren Islands and over Kodiak Island. Those winds come up to about 20 to 25 knots from the east and south. 9-foot seas on either side, 5 to 6-foot seas on the western parts of the Gulf. We keep our variable flow inside Prince William Sound. That remains light, but a stronger southwesterly flow coming into places like Cordova at 20 knots with a 6-foot sea should be expected on Saturday. Now for the Alaska Peninsula, and this is where things will start to shape up into those stronger winds we were talking about. 15 to 20 knots on either side of the peninsula here, with 4 to 8-foot seas on the Bering Sea side, 7 to 9-foot seas on the Pacific side. This is Friday, and as we get into Saturday, you'll notice those winds shifting just a little bit more, especially out to the west here. You'll notice out across the central and western Aleutians, a 50-knot wind there with a 28-foot sea. Out across the western Aleutians, a northeasterly flow already developing on the backside of the storm, 21-foot seas there. A south and southwesterly flow for the central and eastern Aleutians on the Pacific side. Again, these coming up to gale and storm force winds probably by Friday afternoon as the low is working its way right across the southern side of the central and western Aleutians. Southerly flow across Dutch Harbor, Nikolsky, and east of Atka with 12 to 13-foot seas, 30-foot seas though south of Adak and Atka again for Friday. Here's a look at Saturday, and things are already moving along fairly quickly. As we get into the central Aleutians on the south side, Pacific side for Saturday, you'll see the storm force winds continuing there all the way from Nikolsky, south and west, 45-knot winds with 29-foot seas, 30-foot seas a little bit further west, but rapidly improving conditions west of that storm, 20 to 35 knots there on the north side. Bering Sea side, you're looking at 35 to 40 knots with 16 to 22-foot seas, 26-foot seas though developing south of Nikolsky and Dutch Harbor in Alaska. As we get into the west, the areas around the YK Delta and Kuskokwim Bay probably looking at more of a south and easterly flow. Southwesterlies around the Pribilofs with an 8-foot sea, and northerly winds are in charge of St. Lawrence Island and areas around St. Matthew with 12-foot seas expected there. 35-knot winds expected by Saturday with a northeasterly flow continuing north of Nunivak Island and around St. Lawrence Island. And we develop stronger easterlies coming across the Pribilofs with 11-foot seas there, 4-foot seas off of Kuskokwim Bay. For the Arctic coast, a north and westerly flow will be predominant across the Beaufort Sea, and we're going to watch these winds pick up here as we head into Saturday. Again, a wind chill advisory for areas on land, with those wind chill or feels like indices dropping to about 50 to 55 below. The northeasterlies are expected down the Chukchi seacoast for Kivalina and offshore. Those northeasterly winds, again, will probably stir up a little bit of snow, so watch for some blowing and drifting snow there. The winds will be the strongest, though, as you head into the eastern Beaufort seacoast by Saturday. Winds coming out of the west around 30 knots behind that cold front, and a north and northeasterly flow coming down the Chukchi seacoast, 15 to 20 knots. Recapping your weather for tonight around Alaska, a weak wave of low pressure sits on the western side of Prince William Sound. That'll keep some scattered snow showers relatively light around the Copper River Basin. Matsu, Anchorage, still possible to see maybe a little bit of snow here and there. Some light rain and snow across parts of southeast. A much bigger storm coming out of the North Pacific will approach the Aleutians with gales and storm force winds as we head into Friday, especially on the south side of the chain, Pacific side. The low there drops to 965 millibars. We'll keep a scattering of light snow showers across south central and some light precipitation expected across southeast to wrap up the week. An Arctic front's dropping in from the Arctic Ocean. That's going to keep the wind stronger across the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast as a much stronger storm develops across the Bering and the Gulf. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.